Introducing our speaker, Brooke Randolph. She's an adoption therapist, a trainer, author, speaker, and consultant. Brooke is a trauma-informed therapist, certified in brain spotting and image relationship therapy, trained in TBRI, which is trust-based relational interventions, and critical incident stress management, CISM. She's experienced with internal family systems therapy, IFS, is a facilitator for Prepare, Enrich, and Safe and Sound protocol, and she also considers herself ISF informed, polyvagal informed, daring way informed, and influenced by existentialism and psychodynamic theories. Brooke works most often with adult adoptees. She is the founder and executive director of a multi-state group practice, Counseling at the Greenhouse, where all of the therapists she works with are brain spotting trained, adoption informed, and committed to ongoing growth and learning. They meet regularly for consultation and/or supervision. Brooke is a single adoptive parent and kinship caregiver in an open intercountry adoption. Welcome, Brooke.
Okay, let me get these slides up here. And then second as I find your faces. It looks like Marcy already put the poll up, so if you can tell me how you fit in the adoption constellation, that can be really helpful as we go forward. And so while you guys do that, we figure out who is here. Just looking forward to what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the problem with attachment diagnoses as they are, better diagnosis, and a new perspective. And you get to listen to me soapbox. And definitely look forward to your questions and more discussions also. Right. So it looks like everybody answered, and it's about what I expected. We're about 2/3 adoptees, and 13% birth first parents, and 22% adopted. And we didn't ask how many clinicians are in the room, but I recognize several. I have to behave because they know what's up. Oh, I can share the results of the poll so you can see them too if you want to. All right, let's dive in. So Anna introduced me. I think it's important to identify that I am an adoptive parent, and as you said, a kinship caregiver in an open intercountry adoption. I recently updated this slide. There's no longer pictures of my boys up here when I don't have an appropriate back of the head picture of all of them. And two, recognizing that thing where adoptive parents use their kids' photos to earn credentialing. And I don't think that that's what we need to do. So we're going to not do that. Yes, they're adorable. And no, I don't show their faces anyway. But even then, I don't even have to show the back of their heads. So this is my lovely group that we talked about. And then some of the other things that I've done professionally. Let's dive in. Oh, yeah. I also put this slide up because somebody told me that I do a really bad job of talking about myself and sharing experiences. She's like, nobody knows what you've actually done. So I just put it on a slide so I don't have to talk about it. I don't like to talk about me. If you looked at the last slide, I edited a book called It's Not About You, written to adoptive parents primarily, and also birth parents who don't understand adoptee search and reunion. So I'm not very good at making it about me. If you want to know, I've done a lot of things or been involved in spaces. But today we're going to primarily talk from my place as a therapist. Let's talk about the problems with diagnosis. And I probably don't know all the clinicians in here, but several I do that probably agree that there are some major problems in how we diagnose in general. But we do it because people want to use insurance to pay for therapy. And sometimes we need diagnoses to qualify for services, whether that's for kids in schools or for disability. Those kinds of diagnoses can be beneficial to the individual. Um, we can use these labels to shape our treatment planning and to give us some more information. But it's important for us to realize that a diagnosis is just a pattern of symptoms. It's a collection that was decided by a bunch of psychologists, but they also keep changing it. So it's not set in stone. It doesn't define who you are. There are things that used to be in the diagnostic manual that are no longer, and there's things that are not in the diagnostic manual that probably should be. Um, so it's completely imperfect. I tend to come from this place on how does this diagnosis help the individual? Is it helpful or not? And if it's not helpful, then why would I do that? Okay, so what is attachment? This is one of my favorite nerdy books for therapists, The Neuroscience of Psychotherapy. It is a textbook. And these are just some quotes that Dr. Cozzolino included about what attachment is. And so we like to talk about, like in pop psychology, like insecure attachment, secure attachment, disorganized, but it doesn't fit well in boxes, just like people don't fit well in boxes. But to think about attachment as the regulation of what's going on in our body related to how close or far we are from our caregivers. Does that make us feel calm or does that make us anxious? Um, right. So this approach avoidance learning based on relationships. In our close relationships, is it safe? Is it dangerous? Do we want to be close or not? And I think important to think about that these attachment schemas are stored in all of our systems, our sensory and motor, in our posture, in our gait, in how we interact with other people. So it's not just this cognitive emotional construct, and it's not just a classification, and it's certainly not a personality type. And it's not set in stone. Be interesting, though, some things we're going to talk about today that are lasting, but we have lots of research that attachment style can change with the right environment or with the wrong environment. It can also change in the other direction. Okay, so in an older version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, they had two forms of reactive attachment disorder. And now they've separated it into two different diagnoses: reactive attachment disorder, and then this disinhibited social engagement disorder, which basically just means that a child is not inhibited to go seek attention and possibly caregiving from as many people as possible. Okay, so they're even strangers, they may go and try to sit on their lap or try to engage them. They're, and so people see that as a concern because these children might need supervision to protect them from predators, etc. Right? That makes good sense to most of us. Um, so this is just the diagnostic criteria. I highlight that they can't be diagnosed if it is simply impulsivity related to ADHD. Right? You've probably seen some kids who are just really friendly, but not necessarily seeking caregiving from others. But here's the kicker: to get this diagnosis, the child has to have exhibited, I don't even like how they say exhibited, they have experienced a pattern of extreme of insufficient care. They have to have experienced neglect or multiple changes of caregivers or being in an institution. And so when you say that they can't have this diagnosis unless they've had this kind of trauma, to me, like that's a, we're not going to label a kid. How is that beneficial? Because the disorder is the trauma. Right? The symptoms are how they've learned to survive it. But then we come across this research. So 2017, which actually in the research world isn't that long ago, um, although they like to say that that's super old, but like all things considered, what they found when these researchers were looking at people who were adopted from Romanian orphanages into the UK. So these are all UK citizens. That more than half of the children who showed the disinhibited social engagement traits had secure attachment with their adoptive parent. It's not an attachment disorder. And it persisted into adulthood, that those same behavioral things kept happening even in adulthood because it's not an attachment disorder. It's a pattern of neurodevelopment that occurs in response to the deprivation of care that they experience. Um, and also important that it was unrelated to attachment, reported by both the adoptee and the parent. Right, so in these surveys, adoptive parents were filling out reports, adoptees were filling out surveys, and neither of them um, related it to insecure attachment. Then we get into this big one that most of us, I think, hate. I don't know. I don't know all the adoptive parents in this room. Reactive attachment disorder. And so, as we look at the diagnostic criteria, I just want to raise the question: could a child who rarely or minimally seeks comfort when distressed, or doesn't rarely or minimally responds to comfort, could they just feel really insecure in their attachment? Just feel like, I don't know if this is a safe place for me to be responsive. Could a kid who has little responsiveness to others, limited positive affect, so they just like they look sad all the time, um, could that be a symptom of depression? But again, we come back to this criterion C. The child has to have experienced a pattern of extremes of insufficient care. So something didn't work out, something out of this child's control. And now we're going to try to label how they survived it. That to me is a concern. And then the other part is I have yet to see an evaluation that comes to my office that labels a kid with a reactive attachment disorder that sufficiently ruled out autism spectrum disorder. Because they're just forgetting that that's a part of the criteria, because the criterion sets it up so easily for them to get a reactive attachment disorder diagnosis. They forget about all the other things that could be included. Leaning into this idea, the disorder is the trauma, the disorder is what they experienced, and the symptoms are resilience. That's how they survive. And I want to honor that for these kids. Also, when I was in graduate school a very long time ago, more than 20 years ago, um, we would talk about, to receive a diagnosis, someone had to exhibit distress in excess of what would be expected from the stressor. If I broke a nail while I was talking to you and I suddenly burst into tears, you all might think that was a little excessive, right? But if, one of my kids came running in like bleeding or something like that, and I had some sort of reaction, you would probably be like, okay, that makes sense. Right. So is it disordered? Is it in excess of what you would be expected? Or is it a normal reaction to an abnormal situation? And when you start to think about all the things that an individual may have experienced, what they've experienced in utero, what they experienced during birth, what they experienced at separation, what other things that have occurred throughout their lives, all the uncertainty, loss of control, changes, then what really does start to feel excessive? So, thinking about whether it's yourself or someone that you know, whether it's your kid or your client, but you think about all the things included in that story, um, nothing really seems too excessive to me, given those extremes. So, despite what the American Psychological Association tells us, I do not believe that adoption necessarily equals reactive attachment. Okay, so here's the problem with the diagnosis. Not just that I think that it's labeling, right, and creating the stigma and putting the problem on the survivor rather than the problem on the experience. But we also see that when this label is given to a child, that the parents start to lose hope, right? They're never going to attach to me. We're never going to have the family I imagined. And the problem here is that parenting is hard enough that when you're thinking that it's always going to be disappointing, it's never going to be what you want, like you're going to quit investing to a degree. And that's going to make parenting even harder. And then we create then this like self-fulfilling prophecy where they can't attach because you quit attaching. And it's not helpful. So thinking about right the beliefs, the expectations, the behaviors, and how this becomes this cycle. So thinking about and then the stigma that happens with school systems and teachers, you know, if a child ever is involved, whether as a minor or as an adult, if they get involved in the juvenile justice system or the adult justice system and they have this label on them, that's not going to help them. It's only going to make the situation worse. So I lean into how is this a benefit? It certainly is not a benefit for the individual receiving it. And we have to remember all the rule out diagnoses, all the other things that could potentially be influencing the things that we're seeing. Right? We know that there's greater incidence of autism in adoptees. We have to rule out any kind of in utero exposure and how that may or may not have impacted an individual. Things like sensory processing disorder, ADHD, intellectual disabilities, TBI, all of those things can also play a role. And some of these diagnoses can be beneficial to the individual because they can help them receive services that they need, that they can help them receive understanding and compassion from people. Maybe not everybody, but from some people. So rather than putting a label on them that makes them look dangerous or scary, there's something that's saying, hey, this person might need more help. So I would rather that we considered attachment as a spectrum, right? There's not some diagnosis, or sorry, there's not like certain boxes or criterion that you fall into. We we have a spectrum of how we attach in multiple different relationships, and that can change through life, but also remembering that it's going to take time, and it should. Um, Part of the problem is that parents are given really inappropriate expectations to think that it's not going to take time. But if we start to consider all the things that have occurred, then we start to realize that things will develop in their own time. Everyone has their limitations, right? So, how is attachment built? You may have seen this like attachment cycle before, but we see this over and over, right? There is a happy little baby, and then they start to feel hungry and they start expressing that to us, maybe slowly in their facial expressions and their movements, or maybe as much as crying out if a parent hasn't been attuned to see that. And so when the child cries, the parent's like, oh, they need something and meets that need. And then the child is calm and content again. And through this cycle that happens over and over, if we meet a child's needs consistently, quickly, and compassionately, then the brain learns to trust, learns that the world is safe, learns that my needs will be met. And that is how we develop attachment. That's how we develop security, or as Eric Erickson says, trust versus mistrust. And remembering that that co-regulation of the adult re- providing the regulation for the child, and using their providing the regulation by meeting the need, providing the regulation by using their own calm nervous system to help soothe the infant, um, or child, or other adult. Like co-regulation continues to occur throughout life. And some of us do it very naturally, and some of us do it intentionally. And some of us could maybe practice doing it a little bit. And I think I saw Jody come into the room, so she probably didn't know I was going to quote her here. But she once said to me that for even the most loving, nurturing, best intentioned adoptive parents, only the adoptee can make the choice to love, trust, and build a relationship with them. And so it's not about a disorder. That's right. It's just a choice here. And I use this photo from when my youngest was small, and he had these two little stuffies, right? And they're really similar, but they're different. And sometimes he really needed Raccoony, and sometimes he really wanted Barry. And he got to choose what he wanted. And most of the time, we were carrying around both of them, right? And so he had multiple stuffies, but on one day, one was more important, because we all have lots of people that we love, and sometimes we need that, and that should be okay. um, and so thinking about that we can allow our kids of other relationships, um, attachments. We can all have multiple attachments, we can all have multiple parents, and and by doing that, we open up the relationships so that they can feel safe to trust and choose us also. So the realistic expectation is that attachment takes time. At a minimum, therapeutically, I would say that adjustment after an adoption is going to take 6 months plus an additional month for every year of age. Okay. So for a brand newborn, it's going to take a minimum of 6 months to adjust. Okay. So a 1 year old, it's going to take a minimum of 7 months to really start feeling adjusted to this, because this is a major change to move from one family to another, to move into a new house, to move to a new caregiver. And if they've experienced multiple transitions, multiple separations, right? If they had the case where they were maybe separated at birth, and then they're in foster care for 3 months, and then they moved to a different foster care for another year, and then they're moved again, we're going to have like well over a year before this child is ready to attach, before that, because their little nervous system is, when's it going to happen again, when's it going to happen again. And so taking that and having compassion and understanding for how much time that takes, and there's no logic that goes into it, right? Because felt safety is felt, it is not logical, it is not cognitive. um, And so if we go back to the attachment cycle, it doesn't matter if you have a 13-year-old move into your house for the first time, that we still need to provide the same where needs are met quickly, consistently, and compassionately. And if they are not met that way, or if in the past they have not been met that way, then the brain may already be expecting that their needs aren't going to be met, right? They've already decided this isn't going to work out for me. And so we need more repetitions. The older they are, the more things they've experienced, the more as parents we have to invest and really work at that quickly, consistently, and compassionately meeting needs. And that's not easy, especially if you've got multiple kids in your house or you've got the phone ringing off the wall. This is how old I am. Um, or whatever else is happening, right? So you have all these things that are interfering. But if you have a new to your family child, you can't expect them to, like, well, hold on a second. You're a big 13-year-old. Hold on a second while I finish like pouring out the spaghetti. Sounds great and logical, but that doesn't mean that like their internal system can experience that. Even if the kid is telling themselves that they should be able to wait, they're still going to feel that disappointment because what they need for attachment is to know that their needs are important. Um, so trust is built when a child can expect their needs will be met and they believe all their needs are important to their parents. And again, co-regulation is essential. Parents have to stay regulated and calm too. We are the thermostat for our household, and we have to stay regulated. If I had one thing to say to all parents, please stop escalating the situation. Right? You're making it worse. If parents can come in with the like, oh, something's wrong here, let's meet that need, rather than like something's wrong here, we need to pull this together. Right? They're already adding more and escalating the situation rather than trying to turn it down. And so thinking of that about attachment in a new way, that we're going to remember that there's no single way that attachment shows up, right? For some kids, talking about all the hard stuff, talking about how much I miss my other family is a very clear sign that they trust you. A very clear sign that, like, I'm willing to be vulnerable with. Um, and so we have to move beyond our own feelings if we are having feelings about that, so that we can see it for what it potentially is. Thinking about that, an affectionate child who's really clinging on to a caregiver doesn't mean that they're loving that caregiver. It may mean that they're thinking about some other mother. Right? I was babysitting last night, this sweet baby who I take care of pretty regularly, and he was like not going to leave me. Right? He's old enough to crawl, and he was not going to leave my arms. And you know what happened is when his mom showed up, he was a way happier little baby. Right? He really wanted his mom. I was fine to take care of him, but I wasn't what he wanted. But he was clinging to me, but that wasn't a sign that I was what he wanted. But I'm, know him, know his family, know all of this well enough not to think that it's like, oh, look how much he loves me. No, he just needed to be held in that moment. So we're starting to just look at each individual for who they are instead of looking for specific. And that other part of the title, right, why attachment strategies fail, is attachment strategies fail when they're about coercion and control. When we're like, this is my like least favorite example, right? When we're using little Cheerios to try to get kids to make eye contact, that's coercion, right? That's not about connection and compassion necessarily. And particularly when we're very purposely doing it over over to get that. What are you doing and why are you doing it? Right? But when we are focusing on connection, we're focusing on compassion, then relationships build themselves. So, some dangerous strategies that I would like to pretend didn't exist any longer, but I know that at least in 2019, I was listening to people give keynotes and talking about some of these things that they were still doing with kids. So, please don't let your therapist do this. Um, if a therapist is doing any of these things, let's talk about it, but I'm probably going to tell you that it's time to leave, right? When we are forcing anything, when we are being controlling or coercive, that's not going to be helpful. But instead, our therapeutic goals, but also your goals as parents, can be about first finding regulation and learning to experience regulation in your body, in your sensory system, in your emotions. And regulation doesn't mean calm all the time. It means that we learn how to ride the waves. We still get mad, we still get sad, right? We just don't get stuck. Um, and when we can have some physiological regulation, then eventually we can feel safe. We can't feel safe without regulation, and we can't form attachments without felt. And you can't process trauma without attachment because it's too much and it's too scary. So we have got to work on the important things first. And therapeutically, we'll remind parents gently and lovingly that behavior is never on my treatment plan. Right? The behavior is just a symptom, an expression of what hasn't been healed yet. And it will resolve itself after we do these other things that are more important and focusing on the healing of the individual. Okay, so if we believe the disorder is the trauma, which we all do, then what label fits? What is the diagnosis that you're going to advocate for with your therapist or that therapist in the room? Excuse me, are probably already using, at least the ones I recognize. Okay, so a little background how diagnoses came to be. This will be important. So diagnostic labels are dependent on research. Unless there's research that like affirms that this is a thing, then it's not going to be in the manual in a way that can be utilized in a way that could fund your therapy, right? To get your insurance to fund it. But you can't get research unless you have funding. And we know in adoption land that most of the research historically has been funded by the adoption industry and adoptive parents, which has led to some bias. Um, and we also just know in society in general that attachment disruption is not recognized as a trauma by most people. And so it's going to be hard then to get us through to this place where people see that as a trauma. Um, so adoption is a transdiagnostic problem. What is this word transdiagnostic? So it just means that the symptoms vary and the labels are different, but the wound is the same. Right? Just like we have that trope about the good adoptee and the not good adoptee, the wound is the same. We're just playing it out differently. One gets good grades because they're afraid of being rejected, and one is pushing everyone away because they're afraid of being rejected. Right? And so you can see here these things like who doesn't seek comfort gets called RAD. The one who clings is called anxious. A teenager who rages and pushes away gets called OTD, another diagnosis I'm not really a fan of. Um, and the one with good grades is ignored. A first mother who grieves for decades gets called depressed. but the one who is secretive is alone. Adult who struggles with intimacy gets called avoidant or borderline. And all of these things come down to wound of separation, of relationship trauma. So better. Um, in 2005, Bessel van der Kolk was proposing the idea of developmental trauma as a diagnosis. And so there's lots of clinicians who have like grabbed onto that, who talk about developmental trauma, the multiple traumas that we experience as a child, including relational traumas. However, while it recognizes that the wound happens in the relationship, and includes things like abandonment, betrayal, emotional abuse, coercive practices, and disruption. It was rejected due to the lack of research. Um, and the current criteria that they proposed also requires that there's documented abuse or violence. So early separation, parental separation, is not enough to qualify for this diagnosis as proposed if it gets accepted into the next DSM, which wouldn't be until at a minimum 2029. If that would be the absolute earliest we would see that produced anyway. Um, so here's some of the proposed criteria on what that would look like. And these are kinds of things, if you guys ever want me to just share, I can send Marcy a PDF or something or a link. However, she decides she wants to put it up with the YouTube, I will send her the stuff so we can do that. I guess it's on YouTube and you can pause on that here. Okay, so what can we, working with what we've already got, if you want to use your insurance for therapy, you're going to have a diagnosis. You can choose not to use insurance and not get a diagnosis that goes on your permanent medical record, and pay out of pocket and get um, maybe deduct medical care from your taxes. That is an option if you reach a certain level, but talk to your CPA because I am clearly not a CPA on that. But the things that we have that work the closest is this complex PTSD. It's the closest thing that we have. It's going to talk about emotional, relational, and self dysregulation, but it doesn't particularly name attachment disruption as the cause. Um, so there may need to be some additional traumas, but we can use it for children or adults. And as we think about for first parents, many like the idea of the prolonged grief disorder, but it is intended for after a death. And you're probably going to get plenty of therapists who'd be happy to use that diagnosis anyway. The other idea that is in the literature is moral injury, but that's not something that is diagnosable, but it is a little bit more accurate to the cause of what's going on here. When a trusted institution violates your right to parent. Um, so what we know from lots of research is that therapists don't really know what they're doing with adoption. And like the numbers are going to show that probably several of you have had that experience that therapists don't really know what they're doing. So that is why it's one of my passions to keep sharing information, to share information with therapists. That's how I started my morning, is doing a presentation for a group of therapists. And that's how I'm ending my day. It is not for therapists necessarily, but continuing to talk about the information so we can have that for people. And this across all adoption types, adoptees consistently reported the poorest clinician confidence ratios. Is sad, the sad truth of what is there. Um, so last year, This is kind of our hope for the future. In the Clinical Neuropsychiatry, which is a research journal, Farina and Schminti published The Psychopathological Domains of Attachment Trauma, a proposal for clinical conceptualization. Right? This is just being published, it's just being talked about, but it's the first peer reviewed published proposal to name attachment trauma as its own distinct clinical category. So that's pretty huge, actually, for us. Um, and they considered it significant enough that the entire journal was dedicated to it. So they had other people write commentaries based on this article. So we're starting to hopefully maybe build a framework around the wound underneath the diagnosis rather than putting that blame on the individual. And remembering that the disorder is the trauma, the symptoms are resilience, and that resilience deserves treatment and care that understands everything that it's survived. So just, to close and really think about for each of you, adoptees, what you feel is not a disorder. You simply survived and you're allowed to ask for care. It prioritizes your autonomy and understands what you've experienced. To the birth parents, your grief is not excessive. It is the loss you live with, and you deserve a clinician who honors that. And adoptive parents, your child's nervous system is doing exactly what it learned to do, and you don't need to fix anything. You just need to be safe enough, long enough, and your kids will learn something new. And therapists, your clients have been with clinicians who missed it completely or maybe made it worse. But you can be different. Expertise is not a destination, it's a commitment to listening, learning, growing, and never deciding you already have it covered. That's all I present here. And I am happy to have any questions, discussions, or you guys want to bring up.
Thank you so much, Brooke.